Hi, everyone. I think we'll get started. My name is Sara Wachenfeld. I'm Sefaria's Chief Learning Officer, and I'm excited to be here with all of you today with some colleagues who will introduce themselves shortly. I've been with Sefaria pretty much since the beginning, but I've only been in Daf Yomi more than out of it since the beginning of this cycle, though I've always been in and out. And I'm really excited to finish Eruvin with all of you today, whether you're finishing Eruvin with us for the first time or not for the first time, or you're in the Daf Yomi Curious category. We're happy to see you here, and we're happy to get to learn these last few pieces of Eruvin with you. And I'm going to ask Hannah to introduce herself as well.
Hi, I'm Hannah. For those of you on Instagram, I'm at Dafyomi Adventures. For those of you not, you should go follow me. But I am a part of Pardes's Center for Jewish Educators. And I've been doing Dafyomi since this new cycle started in January, and it's really been an amazing time learning and just developing my skills in Talmud, and I'm so glad to be here to share what I've learned throughout this tractate with all of you.
Amazing. And we're so grateful to Hannah for reaching out and telling us that she was a big fan of Daf Yomi and also a fan of Sefaria's, and giving us this opportunity to learn together. So there's a source sheet that's already been shared in the chat with you. And Lizzie's here also. Lizzie, you want to wave? And Lizzie's going to make sure that everything we need is in the chat, and that if you have any questions, you can reach out in chat and ask her. And we'll be pausing a couple times to get any questions or feedback from the group that Lizzie will share. And please feel free to let us know that you're here, where you're joining us from, what your relationship is with Daf Yomi. We're excited to hear from everybody. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And you already have the link to this sheet in the chat, so you can go ahead and pull it up as well. So we're really happy to be here with you today. And one of the things that I'll start with is just to say that Sefaria makes Daf Yomi learning accessible in a lot of ways. And one of the fun things for me, Hannah mentioned some of the excitement that's been there for her in joining the Daf Yomi cycle. I think that it's always about the Gemara itself, but one of the really fun things as well has been watching Sefaria's journey in this Daf Yomi process. This is the first cycle of the Daf Yomi that we kicked off, having the entire Talmud in English and adding the punctuation as we went along. So Masechet by Masechet, tractate by tractate. And if you go on there today, pretty sure, I think I checked last night, you'll see that Psachim, which is the next tractate, is now fully available with Nikud, with vowels, as well as not, if you prefer it that way. And of course, the Talmud is also linked to all of the other connections in our database, such as commentaries, Tanakh references. And that, for me, has been a really fun thing about learning Sefaria, learning Daf Yomi on Sefaria, being able to grab all those links whenever I want them. So here's a little picture of Sefaria's calendar section on our text page. So anytime you're in that home view on Sefaria looking at the different texts, you can see Daf Yomi. Okay, this is from a couple of days ago, but today it would say 105, but you can always find the Daf Yomi piece there and just click on it and it'll take you right to the Daf. And it's a great way to learn the Daf and to join with the many people who have been learning the Daf with us on Sefaria. So that's a new tradition around learning the Daf. I wanted to mention that celebrating the completion of a tractate is actually a really old tradition dating back to Talmudic times. And Hannah, you weren't with us for the last Siyum, or I don't know, maybe you were on Facebook Live. But I think this is something I mentioned a couple times ago, and it's just worth repeating that the tradition that we are reinforcing here today of celebrating when we finish a significant amount of Torah study is something that actually goes back to the Talmud itself. This is probably the most famous source for it, that Abaye, who is a fourth generation Amora, so fourth generation Talmudic rabbi, says that this is like a good thing that he did, that whenever he saw a young Torah scholar, Tzorba Mirabanan, who would finish a Masechet, he would make a Yom Tov, he would make a holiday, a feast, a celebration for all the other rabbis. So we invite you to join us in our virtual feast. We can't send you all treats today, but I hope that you're celebrating however you can and wherever you are, either again, your own accomplishments or those of the people around you. Hannah, I don't know if you said explicitly that you're in Israel. I feel like you have the most options for a fun celebration out of all of us, right? I hope you're
Yeah,
having a
yeah.
party. Yeah, the best I can do is I have my iced coffee here, so that'll be my celebration. But really, it's an ancient tradition to say that we celebrate at this time, and so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to kick off with a brief review of the Masechet. I think it's fun to take a little walk down memory lane and remember some of the places that we've been. Eruvin is a pretty big tractate, so we won't have time to touch on all the different themes, but I wanted to mention two themes, and especially Hannah, to get your voice and your reactions to thinking about this. The first theme is something that we're actually going to come back to when we study the end of the Masechet together. It's about Sukkot and other structures, because actually it's not just building an Eruv that is a major part of this tractate. Obviously, the focus is first and foremost on what it takes to build an Eruv and how you can build an Eruv and when you can build an Eruv and what you use to build an Eruv and all those fun construction projects. But there is a theme that runs throughout that has to do with other famous construction projects in Jewish tradition, to use like the broadest possible term. And the very first one that comes up at the very beginning of Eruvin is the comparison between building an Eruv and building a Sukkah. So this is the first Mishnah. If you have an alleyway that is partially enclosed, it has like a ceiling, but it's 20 amot high, you need to lower the top of that in order for it to work. And then it also goes on to talk about the width of that. And the Gemara, when it starts talking about this Mishnah, it immediately compares it to another Mishnah. Sukkah shehi gvoha lamala me'esrim amah psula. A sukkah that is higher than 20 amot, than 20 cubits, is not considered to be kosher by the majority opinion. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. And there are many times actually throughout the tractate when this comparison between alleyways and Eruvin and things that we can build to join places together for purposes of Shabbat, when that whole conversation is compared to another building conversation, which is building your sukkah, what makes it kosher and what makes it not kosher. The other kind of comparison that we'll see when we talk about the last page of our tractate, the last daf, is the comparison to the Mikdash, to the temple, which is another like great building project in Jewish history. Another time where we have specifics about how large and how small things have to be and how exactly they have to be constructed. And that's something that comes up a lot. So if you have a favorite, a memory of either specific citation or just a general memory of somewhere in Masechet Eruvin where another structure is brought as a point of comparison, please put that into the chat. I'd love to collect all of your thoughts. And Hannah, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that or a time when you remember this coming up.
Yeah, one thing that I was thinking about when reading these sections is more than just the measurements, but thinking about how we can use these structures and using structures in general to make our community accessible. So I know one thing that I thought about is when we're building our community sukkah at home is making sure that everyone is able to come and partake. And this year with COVID, with Pardes, we set up a whole spreadsheet of when people could come to different sukkahs. So even if you weren't necessarily able to build your own, right, we created a framework to allow for everyone to come and to benefit and to celebrate. So that I thought was really key, because accessibility is really huge, and we see that throughout the tractate. If your Eruv is too high and you aren't able to reach it, right, it's not considered a valid Eruv.
Yeah, I love that. I think that that's right, and I think that part of that accessibility piece is also the sanctity, right? That these are sukkah and the temple. Those were the spaces, or those are the spaces that signify a kind of presence of God, right? One of the definitions of what it means to have a sukkah is that we're reminding ourselves of the Ananeha Kavod, God's presence that kind of hovered among the Jewish people when they were traveling through the desert. And of course, the temple, which is not something that we've experienced, but as it's discussed in Jewish sources, was a locus for God's holiness. And I think that if you view the Eruv that way as something that was meant to, I think, both bring people together and the holiness that comes from that accessibility that you're talking about, Hannah, but also I think it maybe gives everybody a sense of also this like hovering Shekhinah. If you always have the sense that there's this like invisible structure around you at all times. I mean, it's visible, but it's hard to see often. And maybe you only know it's there if you're the one who stuck the food there for the Eruv, or you might not be the person who's most aware of it. But it does give this sense of God's presence in the community or the divine, or just a call to kind of higher purposes that we feel hopefully all the time, but especially on Shabbat. The second theme that I feel like it's a little bit of a spoiler because Hannah is going to jump more into this in her source sheet at the end. But I do feel like getting to know your neighbors is a theme that runs throughout, not always in the most positive ways. Like I think, Hannah, I like your story about, offering everybody a sukkah. I think that one of the things that comes from Eruvin is like, sometimes you have kind of like a deadbeat neighbor who just doesn't participate and you got to figure out how to work around them. But okay, fine. In the rosiest possible view of this, you're getting to know different people and you're getting to know them in different ways, because sometimes it's about their journey outside the allotted space on Shabbat, and sometimes it's about how to include them in the Eruv, and sometimes it's about the food that they would contribute, and all different kinds of partnerships that can make them part of the Eruv. So I really like this little piece from kind of midway through the tractate. Amar Rabbi Eli, V'shlosha dvarim adam nikar. There are three ways that you get to know a person: v'koso, v'kiso, v'kaaso. It's fun in English too, but it's more fun in Hebrew because the words have this kind of alliterative way that they sound. V'koso, v'kiso, v'kaaso. You get to know a person through their cup, through their pocket, and through their anger. So in other words, the way a person behaves when they're drunk, the way a person behaves financially, their financial dealings, and the way they behave when they're angry. Those are the three best ways to get to know somebody. Va'amrilai af b'sachako. And some people say it's also through their laughter that you get to know them. And there is this sense, I think, throughout Masechet Eruvin that, again, it is about getting to know your neighbors. If you want to make an Eruv in your courtyard and you have other people living in that courtyard, so you're going to have to knock on their doors. And if you want to have a Eruv in your mavoy, in your alleyway, you're going to have to get to know all your neighbors, right? Casting the net a little farther. And when you figure out how far you can travel outside the city on Shabbat, you have to figure out what are the parameters of the city, who's in and who's out. And maybe through that process, you do get to know them in all of these ways. I do think, like you said, Hannah, that it's interesting to think about this, especially in COVID times when like maybe door knocking isn't how we would most get to know people. But I still think it's interesting, this sense that when you want to join together for this kind of Shabbat protective activity, you're going to need to get to know the individuals. And I think the other source that speaks to this is maybe the most classic source on Eruv. Again, kind of a spoiler for Hannah's class, but it says Hamakpid al Eruvo, ein Eruvo Eruv. If you're too particular about your Eruv, that other people not eating or drinking from the food you contributed, then it's not even a valid Eruv. Mashmo Eruv Shemo. The whole thing is called an Eruv. The whole point is to mix, is to mingle with other people. You can't go to a potluck and be like, nobody's allowed to eat my food. You kind of miss the point. And so the point of this is, it's an Eruv. We're getting together. We're joining together over this particular food. And so I can't be particular about it. I'm curious to have everybody else put in the chat if there were other moments in Masechet Eruvin that you think speak to this theme. I have a few contenders in mind. And Hannah, what else would you tell us about this source, which I know was one of your favorites too?
Yeah. So one thing I just found to be very meaningful and speaking to me is this idea, right, that Eruv is really all about connections, right? We're not just connecting so that we can carry, right? But as I'll talk about more when we get to the source sheet, to my source sheet, is that an Eruv is really about connecting us in community. And what does that mean when we have to incorporate food and incorporate maybe someone who we don't know so well? How we can make sure that the people we're joining with are trustworthy and responsible, and that we know that they'll be beneficial to our Eruv and to our community. And what happens if that's not always the case, right? Um, so really this idea of joining and mutual responsibility is so key when we're thinking about how we're able to use our partnerships and create authentic relationships and spaces to build a community that can really stand the test of time.
Yeah, it's so funny that you say that, because I think, when you start with this, so this is like, this happens on page like Daf, Memtet. So really like a pretty good ways into the Masechet. And I think that's so typical of the Talmud that on the one hand, I think you're right. Like there is this theme of connection and inclusivity, but if you're like to get there, you have to power through, daf after daf of like trying to figure out like how the circumference of a circle is affected if you square it, and things like that. I don't even think I said that right, but right, you have to figure out all these math calculations in order to get to this point of realizing that connection. I think that actually, like as I think about it, it goes back to the theme of structures, that we're not the kind of religion that's just like, yeah, like build something that can fit everybody, or like build something that you think is good for this purpose. That's not how the Talmud is. It's like, no, we're going to tell you exactly how to do it so that it is perfectly optimized for the purpose. And it's about carrying, it's about this, and it's about that. And you have to kind of hold on for these little gems, right? You have to work your way through. And then you finally get to, oh yeah, because actually the word Eruv itself signifies that larger purpose that you've been talking about. And I think that that's really true. And really a fun thing about making it through Eruvin is to be able to reflect back on these themes and realize that they were there all along, even as we look through those very minute calculations. Math is not my favorite, so those were challenging for me. But I feel like passages like this were kind of the reward. I want to use these themes then as a lens to look at the very end of the Masechet. If you're being Messiah now, if you're just going to finish it up now, I would encourage you to go ahead and open up the Talmud in whatever way, shape, or form you would like. I'm going to actually click on the source in the source sheet to see it in context. So while everybody is opening up their own text if they want to, I'll pause and see if we have any questions from our Facebook audience. If there's anything pressing coming in, I'll ask Lizzie to share it with us. And otherwise, or once we're done with that, we'll go on to this final piece of the Masechet.
We do not have any pressing questions at the moment, but feel free to send them in.
Amazing. Thanks, Lizzie. So the end of the Masechet, I know, Hannah, we didn't talk because the last time that we spoke, I think was actually, it was before the last parak started. Is that right? I think that's true.
Yeah.
The last chapter was kind of short. And I know about you, I felt like my first reaction was that the last chapter was kind of a little bit of an outlier. Like we were talking about, not so much about building the Eruv anymore. And in a sense, the theme, I think, two themes of the last parak. One is, I'd say, like writ large, the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. That's something that goes back to that theme of structures, and that really gets driven home here. And then the other piece is kind of like rabbinic legislation, because all of Eruv, or most of Eruv, kind of falls into that conversation. What's rabbinic legislation that gets added on? And that's kind of like where we end up here. So what I like about learning this on Sefaria, we're in the end of the Gemara on 105, but it starts off with a quote from the Mishnah, so it's pretty easy to scroll back if you wanted to and see where the Mishnah is, and also to kind of not lose your place, because I also have it on the source sheet. So you can see that there was already significant discussion about this Mishnah, but we're going to talk about the very end of the Mishnah. So we started off with talking about, again, we're definitely in the temple. We're talking about how to get rid of dead, creepy, crawly things from the temple. I don't know, Hannah, anything you want to say about this theme? How'd this one strike you?
Well, as you mentioned before, with this idea of the temple, and both the temple and the Eruv representing this level of sanctity, right? The rabbis give us all these mishnayot and this framework to kind of remind us where we sometimes have to draw those lines of what we can and can't do. Right? Sometimes when we're with a community, we want to just be able to do everything, but we need to be able to take that step back and recognize, okay, there are times where these actions are okay, but other times when maybe they're prohibited. And finding that balance of, well, when can I do certain things to support my community, and when is there a time where doing such an action would actually hinder or detract from what my community is trying to do?
That's really interesting. Yeah, I hear that, and I think that I think this is maybe a good example because it's one of those really like mundane things that you could feel like, oh, like who cares, right? Like on some level, who cares? The English translation here, the Steinsaltz translation, the translation that comes from Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz of blessed memory, who passed away not that long ago, gives you some clues because it links to the verses in Leviticus that tell you exactly which kinds of creepy crawly things, reptiles and rodents, are not allowed to be in the Beit HaMikdash. And if you read up on that, then you'll kind of get a sense of why it's a big deal. But otherwise, like, yeah, it would be one of those things that's like, but we're having a community celebration. Why do I care if there's like a dead creepy crawly thing in my space? So this Mishnah presumes that you do care and talks about how you might remove it. And the very end of the Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon says, Makom shehitiru lecha chachamim, mishalcha natnu lecha. Whenever the rabbis permit something, at least in this context, mishalcha natnu lech, they're giving it to you from within your own context. Shelo hitiru lecha ela mishum shvut. They're only giving you permission to do things that were prohibited in the first place because of what's called shvut, because of rabbinic categories of prohibited things. In other words, when you make the rules, then you get to decide when to break the rules. And you don't get to maybe break someone else's rules. Maybe, Hannah, I feel myself sort of instinctively framing this in the terms that you were using. And maybe this is also about community norms and community boundaries. When you set the rules, you get to break them. You don't get to break other people's rules, or you don't get to break divine rules, but you do have flexibility and leeway within the rules that you set up. So that's the last section of the Mishnah, which again, now the Gemara is going to discuss in some length. So here we go. Rabbi Shimon Hecha Kai. Where is Rabbi Shimon? Literally, like, where is he standing? What's he thinking about when he is making this statement? Because it seems like a more sweeping statement and not just about the specific circumstance in this Mishnah. And the response is Hatam Kai Zitznan Mishech Shichutz Tzchum Afilu Amachat Lo Yikanes. If you've been with us throughout, if you've been with Daf Yomi throughout, this might sound familiar to you. He's actually thinking about a mission that we learned earlier. If it gets dark, when you are outside of the tchum, the amount of space that you're allowed to travel on Shabbat, or the distance that you're allowed to travel on Shabbat, you can't come in. You can't even come 1 cubit in. Cubit is about an arm's length, so you really can't move. You're kind of stuck. Rabbi Shimon Omer, afilu chamesh esra ama yikanes. But Rabbi Shimon, in that Mishnah there, again, earlier in the tractate, says, no, you can move even 15 amot, even 15 cubits, lefi she'en hameshuchot mematzin hamidot mipnei hatuim, because basically we're not so exact when we make our tchum measurements. When we measure from the edge of the city 2,000 amot outwards, we're not so exact, mipnei hatuim, because we know people are going to mess up a little bit. And you have a better translation of that, Hannah, like, because of those who err. But I think the idea is we don't want to be too exact with our measurements because we're afraid of keeping people out. So that's their assessment of what Rabbi Shimon is thinking about. Because yeah, the first Tana, the first opinion in that Mishnah says you can't even move, and Rabbi Shimon's like, no. When we're making these rabbinic rules, we leave wiggle room, kind of like we're only human, and we leave wiggle room to literally let people wiggle their way back in to the Shabbat boundaries. Rabbi Shimon then goes on to say, the only reason that it was allowed is because of these rabbinic decrees. So again, where's he at? What's he thinking about? What he's thinking about when he says this is a couple of Mishnayot ago. Maybe it was just the one before. I don't know. Hannah, let me know if you remember. It was definitely in this chapter, I think, where a string of a musical instrument breaks in the temple on Shabbat. And there's a discussion about how you're allowed to fix it, whether you can tie it with a knot, which would be transgressing the category of not making knots on Shabbat, but maybe that's okay. And Rabbi Shimon says you can tie it with a bow, which is like a lesser form of knots. So that's like more okay maybe. And he says, a bow which isn't going to reach the threshold of transgressing the Torah level prohibition, that's okay. The rabbis are like, that's fine. You can transgress our prohibition. You just, again, the rules that we make, we can let you break. But an actual knot, we wouldn't permit that, because that's actually a prohibition that involves a Torah decree. And that is the end of the Masechet. Hadron Alacha Motzeh Tefillin Uslika La Masechet Eruvin. Mazal Tov, everybody. We finished the Masechet. Again, ending off with this piece about the temple, and really, I think, and Hannah, I'm curious if you want to say a few words about how this fits into your the theme you were talking about earlier about inclusivity, but really focusing on like the rabbinic nature of all of these laws as opposed to a Torah lens on them.
Yeah, when we have a rabbinic lens versus when it's Derabanan versus Deraita, right? We have, as you were saying, right, we have some more flexibility in how we can interpret and allow for some leeway. And that's right, that's exactly what we see here, right? Where, as you pointed out, right, like we can create some leeway and some bending a little bit of the halakha to allow those who maybe are who are making, who err or who making a mistake for whatever reason, right, to be able to come in and join in, right? We're not measuring precisely, right? Why are we not measuring precisely? Because we want to make sure that we're able to be a bit more inclusive, and allowing those who maybe are just making that mark to be able to come in and to enter our community.
Yeah, I also think it's so interesting. Like one of the whole mind shifts that you have to make in this, it comes up other places. Like it comes up a lot in Sukkah also, but also in this last parak, is to remember that like they were actually more permissive in the temple, which maybe is like counterintuitive. I don't know if you like go to synagogue, when we used to go to synagogue, whatever, right? You might feel like, well, that's like a stricter space. Like whatever rules I keep myself at home, like I have to sort of, keep stricter rules when I'm like near the rabbi or whatever. But the whole theme of this last chapter is like, no, actually, the closer you are to that source of authority, the more relaxed you can be, because we're less worried there. It's more like when you go home into your private spaces that we have to keep remembering that we are connected by that larger eruv to everybody else. So I think that's a really interesting tension here. I'm going to close the text itself and go back into the source sheet, and ask Hannah to lead us in the Hadran, the traditional prayer that's said at the end of every tractate. We are not going to say all of it. Hannah will read some excerpts. You can find it on Sefaria. You could, for example, click from the source sheet to find it. in Hebrew and in English on Sefaria, and you can recite the full thing on your own if you wish, but Hannah, why don't you lead us in some parts of it now so we can celebrate.
Hadran alach Masechet Eruvin, v'hadrach alan da'atan alach Masechet Eruvin, v'da'atach alan la nitnoshe minach Masechet Eruvin, v'lo titnoshe minan la be'alma hadain v'lo be'alma da'at Yehiratzon milfanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu Shetei Toratecha Umanutenu ba'olam hazeh v'tehei Imanu l'olam haba Chanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachi bar Papa, Surcha bar Papa, Ada bar Papa, Deru bar Papa. Ha'erev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratecha yifnu ufifiot amcha Beit Yisrael v'nehiyeh anachnu kulanu v'tze'atza'enu v'tze'atza'e amcha Beit Yisrael kulanu yodei shmecha v'lomdei Toratecha me'oivai techach meni mitzotecha ki le'olam hili yehili bi tamim bechukecha lema'an lo evosh le'olam lo eshkach pikudecha ki vam chitani baruch ata Adonai lamdeni chukecha amen amen selah v'vaed. Right, we will return to you, Tractate Eruvin. Right, we're never done our learning. We'll come back.
It feels maybe especially true with Eruvin, right, where there's definitely so much more to do.
Yes.
Amazing. I hope that everyone following along says whichever parts of it you wish. Hannah, tell us about the next step.
Okay, so our next step will be moving into a Coverto Roulette. So for this, right, we're going to invite you all to take a deeper dive into these themes of community that we've been talking about, and using this brand new feature that Sarah will talk about in a moment. So as you go through the source sheet, some things I'm hoping that you all will think about is how do we connect to those in our community, right? With Eruv as this bond, right? As this idea of joining and coming together. And from this, I've kind of outlined 5 main themes for values that we should really work to include in our community in order to create a community that's accessible and open. And these are respect, responsibility, compassion, accessibility, and partnership. We've talked a bit about some of these themes already, but I'm inviting you all to take a look at the source sheet that will be shared with you soon. And to really dive in and think about how we can actively work together to include and strengthen the partnerships we have in order to build our Eruv, our connections, and our community. So I encourage you all to really join us and take a deeper dive into these sources to add your own ideas into how Tractate Eruvin really allows us to build this strong, resilient, and connected community.
Awesome. So as you can see from this sheet, Coverto Roulette is a feature that we haven't publicly released yet, and TBD if we will, but it's a fun thing to play with. And when Hannah showed me this sheet that she had made, which by the way, just want to say anyone can build a source sheet on Sefaria, and many of you do, but not all of you share them. So big props to Hannah for sharing it out. By the time I went to look at it, it was already public on the site. It's a great I think, summary of these important themes in Masechet Eruvin, and just a fun way to kind of get inside it. And I thought it'd be fun to play the Coverto Roulette game. What this is going to let you do is jump into a Coverto, jump into a brief learning partnership with someone you've never met before, or maybe you have met before, who knows? Basically spinning the roulette wheel and landing yourself with a study partner. It's a new feature on Sefaria. We're releasing it on a limited basis. We're letting organizations play with it if they want to, synagogues. If you want to know more, feel free to be in touch. But in the meantime, we hope you'll stay on, whether you have 5 more minutes free, 10 more minutes free, 20 minutes free, an hour free. There's no particular time commitment. You can also learn for a while with one partner and then click the next person and see if you want to go on to another learning partner. But Lizzie's going to put up that link. And what you're going to need to do is close out of the Zoom. This is a different video conferencing technology, so it doesn't play super nicely with Zoom. So close out of Zoom, or no, I'm in Zoom. I have to close out of Zoom, but you're on Facebook Live. So you can close the Facebook Live. There won't be anything more to see there. And click on this link, and it will take you both to Hannah's source sheet as well as to a video chat with another person. If you don't see someone right away, you can refresh the page or click the new Coverto button. Either way, the page will refresh. I have no idea how many people will join, so I can't tell you for sure if there's going to be an even number or an odd number. That's part of the Coverto Roulette fun and uncertainty. You might have to wait a few minutes or try a few times before you get someone. And I wish you happy and productive learning. And as Hannah said when she read the Hadran, we pray that Ha'arevna, we pray that Torah is sweet in our mouths. So this is a sweet new way of encountering Torah through our Coverto Roulette. I hope you'll all have a lot of fun. And Lizzie, I'm assuming you're sharing that link and everyone can say goodbye and jump in, right?
Yes, the link is now in the chat and we hope that you enjoy.
Amazing. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Hannah. Maybe I'll see you in Coverto.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye-bye.